7 Stoic rules that make your mind unbreakable. Stoic philosophy for emotional control. The war inside you. There is a war happening inside you right now. Not in the headlines, not in your bank account, not in any relationship or circumstance around you. Inside you. And the most dangerous part is not that the war exists. It is that most people never learn to fight it correctly. They throw emotions at it. They throw distractions at it. They throw noise, speed, consumption, and comparison at it. And the war continues. Because none of those things are weapons. They are just more fuel for the fire. You have been told in 1,000 different ways that the solution to your emotional chaos lives somewhere outside of you. That the right job will bring peace. That the right relationship will bring security. That the right achievement will bring silence to the anxiety that wakes you at 3 in the morning and tells you that you are not enough, not safe, not in control. You have been sold this lie in books, in algorithms, in the quiet pressure of a world that profits from your restlessness. The Stoics were not interested in selling you comfort. Marcus Aurelius, writing alone in his tent between military campaigns, was not composing feel-good aphorisms. Epictetus, who was born into slavery and had his leg broken by a cruel master, did not build a philosophy of wishful thinking. Seneca, who lived in the corridors of imperial power and watched men destroy themselves in pursuit of more, did not sit down to write poetry about happiness. These men built something harder, colder, and infinitely more useful. They built a philosophy of the mind that could survive anything. What you are about to encounter is not a collection of quotes. It is not a listicle of habits. It is a set of rules. 7 rules. Each one a direct confrontation with the way your mind has been operating without your permission. Each one a blade. Not to wound you, but to cut away what has been weighing you down for years without a name. The mind that does not break is not the mind that never faces difficulty. It is the mind that has been trained, deliberately and relentlessly, to transform difficulty into discipline, chaos into clarity, and fear into focused action. That mind is not a gift. It is not a personality type. It is not reserved for philosophers, warriors, or people who had better childhoods than you did. It is built, rule by rule, day by day, decision by decision. You are not here to be inspired and then forget. You are here to be interrupted, to have the patterns you have accepted as permanent shown to you as choices. Because the moment you see a pattern as a choice, you have the power to choose differently. That is the entire promise of Stoic philosophy. Not that life will get easier, that you will get stronger. Stronger in a way that does not depend on circumstances, does not require anyone's approval, and cannot be taken from you by any force in the world. The war inside you is real, but so is your ability to win it. It starts now. Rule 1. Master the stories you tell yourself. The first rule does not ask you to change your behavior. It asks you to do something far more difficult. To stop and look at the sentence your mind just formed before you reacted. Epictetus opens the Enchiridion with one of the most quietly revolutionary statements in the history of human thought. He writes that some things are within our power while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. This is not a passive observation. It is a surgical distinction that, once made with precision, begins to dismantle the architecture of unnecessary suffering. You do not suffer events. You suffer the story you build around events. A traffic jam is a traffic jam. The suffering attached to it is the story. That this is unfair. That you are always the one this happens to. That everything is working against you today. The traffic jam lasted 20 minutes. The story lasted 3 hours. This is not a trivial distinction. When Epictetus's master broke his leg, the bone was broken. But what Epictetus refused to break was the narrative. He refused to assign to that event the power to define his worth, his freedom, or the direction of his interior life. He said simply that the leg was broken, not that his life was over, not that he was a victim, Not that the world was cruel and nothing could be done. The bone was broken. That was the fact. Everything else was a story. You have inherited stories. Some of them were handed to you in childhood, told so many times they have calcified into convictions. That you are not resilient enough. That you are the kind of person things go wrong for. That difficulty is a sign you chose the wrong path. That piece is for other people, calmer people, luckier people, people who did not experience what you experienced. Epictetus would look at every one of those stories and ask one question. Who wrote that? Not what happened to you. Who wrote the meaning you assigned to what happened? Because if you wrote it once, you can rewrite it now. This is not toxic positivity. The Stoics had no patience for that. It is not the instruction to pretend that bad things are secretly good. It is the instruction to practice what Epictetus called prosos, attention, a sustained, disciplined awareness of the mental impressions that arrive before reason has had the chance to weigh in. Most people live their entire emotional lives in the gap between the event and the reflection, in the raw, unexamined impression. And they mistake that raw impression for reality. It is not reality. It is the first draft. And unlike most first drafts, this one is running your life. The practice begins with a single pause. Something happens. Before you react, before you speak, before you decide what it means, pause. Ask one question. Is this the event, or is this my story about the event? That question will not always be comfortable to ask. Some of the stories you will find are ones you have been protecting fiercely, because dismantling them means accepting responsibility for the suffering they created. That is the price of the first rule, and it is absolutely worth paying. Rule 2. Surrender what was never yours. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you have worked. It is the exhaustion of trying to control things that were never yours to control. It lives in the shoulders, in the jaw, in the low-grade anxiety that follows you into sleep, and is already waiting when you open your eyes. The Stoics had a name for the principle that dissolves this exhaustion. They called it the dichotomy of control. Marcus Aurelius expresses it in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, Paragraph 3, with the observation that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. But this is more than a quote to post on a wall. It is an invitation to surgery, to go inside the daily experience of living and begin identifying, with ruthless precision, which things belong to you and which do not. What belongs to you? Your intentions, your attention, your effort, your response, your values, your choices. That is the complete list. Everything else, every outcome, every other person's behavior, every external circumstance, every opinion held about you by people who do not live your life, belongs to a category that the Stoics considered outside the scope of your legitimate concern. This is not indifference. The Stoic does not stop caring about outcomes. He stops making his peace conditional on them. There is an enormous difference between working toward something with full commitment and holding your emotional well-being hostage to whether that thing occurs. The first is virtue, the second is a trap. Think about the last time you were genuinely disturbed. Not annoyed, not inconvenienced, truly disturbed, unable to find stillness. What was the source? In almost every case, it was the behavior of something or someone outside your sphere of control. A person who did not act the way you needed them to act. A situation that did not resolve the way you required it to resolve. A world that did not cooperate with the version of it you had constructed in your mind. Seneca writes in his letters to Lucilius, Letter 1, that you must reclaim your own time, that we waste the greatest part of life in bad intentions, most of it in doing nothing at all, and the whole of it in doing something other than what we ought. The squandering of energy on the uncontrollable is one of the deepest forms of wasting life, because time and energy poured into what cannot be changed is not only useless, it actively degrades the capacity to act on what can. The practice of this rule is a daily audit. Every time you feel the grip of anxiety or the heat of frustration, stop and ask one question. Is this within my sphere? If the honest answer is no, then the Stoic prescription is clear. Release it. Not because you do not care, because you understand that caring does not make the uncontrollable controllable. It only makes the uncontrollable painful. What remains after you have released what is not yours is something remarkable. It is a narrow, clean, and sovereign territory. It is smaller than the mind wants it to be. But within it, your power is absolute. And absolute power over even a small and real domain is worth infinitely more than the illusion of control over a vast and imaginary one. Rule 3. Let the obstacle become the weapon. Marcus Aurelius writes in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 5, paragraph 20, that the impediment to action advances the action. What stands in the way becomes the way. These words were written by a man who ruled the Roman Empire during a period of plague, military invasion, and political collapse. He did not write them from a place of ease. He wrote them from the center of the fire. The modern relationship with obstacles is almost entirely wrong. An obstacle is interpreted as a signal to stop, to recalibrate, to doubt. It is read as evidence that the path was wrong, the plan was flawed, or the person attempting the thing is not equipped for it. And so the obstacle does exactly what a prison wall does. It stops movement. Not because it has the power to, but because the mind grants it that power. The Stoic inversion is not an optimistic reframe. It is a structural reorientation. It does not say the obstacle is secretly a blessing. It says the obstacle is material, raw material, from which the next action is forged. The obstacle is not something that happened to your plan. It is the new plan. Consider the biography of Epictetus. Born into slavery, his education in philosophy had to be practiced in conditions of forced servitude and physical brutality. The obstacle, the lack of freedom, the daily exposure to contempt, did not produce a broken man. It produced the most precise and demanding Stoic voice in the ancient world, not because hardship automatically generates wisdom, but because Epictetus chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to use the hardship as the forge rather than the grave. This is the distinction the Stoics draw. The same fire that melts wax hardens steel. The question is not what the obstacle is. The question is what you are made of, and more importantly, what you choose to make yourself into in response to it. There is a practical dimension to this rule that goes beyond philosophy. When the mind is trained to search for the use in an obstacle rather than the injustice of it, the response time to difficulty accelerates. The grieving phase, the energy spent in resistance, complaint, and disbelief, compresses. Not because the difficulty is denied, but because the energy of engagement shifts from passive suffering to active adaptation. Every significant setback in your life contains inside it a set of capabilities you would not have developed without it. The loss that taught you what you could live without. The failure that revealed the assumption you had been making without knowing. The rejection that forced you to a path that turned out to be yours. You did not choose those obstacles, but you can choose, retroactively and prospectively, whether they were material or just damage. The next time something blocks your path, ask not how to remove the obstacle. Ask what the obstacle is teaching you to do. Ask what strength it is demanding from you that you did not know you had. Ask what would have remained soft and untested if this difficulty had not arrived. The answer to those questions is not a consolation. It is a set of instructions. Rule 4. Stop labeling. Start seeing. The human mind is a labeling machine. It does not experience events neutrally. It experiences them through a rapid, largely unconscious process of categorization. Good or bad, fair or unfair, safe or threatening, deserved or undeserved. This process happens faster than conscious thought. By the time you are aware of how you feel about something, the label has already been applied, the judgment has already been made, and your emotional response is already in motion. The Stoics were deeply interested in this mechanism. Epictetus, in the Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 1, identifies the act of assent, the moment when the mind agrees with an impression and converts it into a belief, as the precise location of human freedom. Not in changing circumstances. Not in overpowering emotions, in the act of assent, in whether you agree with the impression or examine it. The Greek word for this practice of suspended judgment is epoche. It is borrowed from the skeptic tradition, but given a specific application by the Stoics, not the suspension of all belief in the name of philosophical uncertainty, but the deliberate pause before accepting a first impression as truth. The Stoic practice of epoche is not doubt, it is discernment. It is the refusal to let the labeling machine run on autopilot when the stakes are high. Here is what this looks like in practice. Someone says something that strikes you as an insult. The labeling machine fires instantly, disrespectful, hostile, unfair. Your body responds, tension, heat, the contraction of defensive emotion, and you are already in a reaction before you have determined whether the label was accurate, before you have asked what the person actually meant, before you have considered that your interpretation might be colored by your mood, your history, or your assumptions. The Stoic pause, the application of epoche, does not deny that the comment stung. It asks one simple question: is the label true? Not whether the feeling is valid, not whether the reaction is understandable, whether the label is accurate, because the label is what the response is being built on, and a response built on an inaccurate label is not a response. It is a performance of a projection. Marcus Aurelius returns to this theme repeatedly in the Meditations. In Book 6, paragraph 13, he writes that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment. The power to revoke the estimate is not weakness, it is not indifference. It is the most precise form of self-governance available to a thinking being. The liberation in this rule is not that life becomes less painful, it is that the pain becomes honest. When you stop labeling reflexively and start seeing clearly, the suffering that remains is proportional to the actual event, not inflated by narrative, not escalated by the story layered on top of the story layered on top of the fact. That kind of proportional suffering is bearable. More than bearable, it is workable. You can act from honest pain. You cannot act clearly from the elaborate construction of an unchecked mind. Rule 5. Rehearse loss before it arrives. This rule will be the most uncomfortable one. Not because it is philosophically complex, but because it runs directly against the instinct most people bring to the subject of loss, avoidance. Most people do not think about losing what they love because thinking about it seems like an invitation, as though imagining loss has the power to summon it, as though gratitude requires the permanent exclusion of the possibility of absence. The Stoics saw this protective avoidance not as wisdom, but as a vulnerability. Because the thing you refuse to think about does not disappear. It waits. And when it arrives, and at some point in some form it will arrive, it arrives with the full force of something your mind has never rehearsed. The shock is not just the loss. It is the complete unreadiness of a mind that had no practice with even the concept. Seneca writes in his Letters to Lucilius, letter 77, that there is nothing the wise man does more reluctantly than die, but neither does he do it more miserably. He is prepared. And preparation, for Seneca, begins in the mind long before the event arrives in life. The practice is called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. It is a deliberate, structured contemplation of what could be lost: health, relationships, position, possessions, and time. Not with the goal of living in dread, but with the specific goal of removing the ambush power that loss holds over an unprepared mind, because the first casualty of unexpected loss is not the thing lost, it is the capacity to function after it. There is a secondary benefit to this practice that the Stoics considered equally important. When you contemplate the absence of something you love, the presence of it becomes vivid in a way that habitual comfort never allows. You stop taking for granted what you have rehearsed losing. The person sitting across from you at dinner becomes irreplaceable when you have, in quiet and private contemplation, sat with the reality of their absence. The health of your body becomes extraordinary when you have genuinely considered what life looks like without it. Marcus Aurelius applies this practice to himself directly in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, paragraph 3, when he meditates on the impermanence of all things, people, empires, ideas, seasons. He is not performing pessimism. He is practicing gratitude through the lens of transience. He is stripping the present of the numbness that familiarity creates. The practice of negative visualization does not breed despair. Despair is what happens when loss arrives without preparation. What this practice breeds is something far more useful: a present tense richness of attention, an appreciation that does not require deprivation to remain awake, and a resilience that, when difficulty does arrive, recognizes it not as an ambush, but as something the mind has already in some measure met. You will lose things. This is not a prediction. It is the single most reliable feature of a human life. The question is not whether the losses will come. The question is whether the mind that greets them will be standing on prepared ground or on sand. Rule 6. Guard the inner citadel. Marcus Aurelius returns, again and again in the Meditations, to one image above all others: the citadel, the inner fortress of the mind, the ruling faculty, what the Greeks called the hegemonikon, that governs thought, response, and will. He returns to it not because it is a comforting metaphor, but because it is a daily reminder of something he knew the pressures of empire could make him forget: that there is a part of him that cannot be touched unless he allows it to be touched. This is not mysticism. It is not spiritual escapism. It is a precise and practical philosophical claim that the innermost faculty of rational judgment, the part of you that chooses how to respond, what to value, and who to be, cannot be compelled from the outside. It can be seduced. It can be eroded through negligence. It can be surrendered voluntarily through fear, laziness, or the slow accumulation of compromises. But it cannot be taken by force. Epictetus lived this claim with more intensity than almost any other figure in ancient philosophy. His freedom of body was removed by law. His freedom of movement, of profession, of social status, all of it stripped. And yet the discourses of Epictetus, transcribed by his student Arrian, reveal a man of extraordinary interior sovereignty, not because his circumstances were good, but because he understood with absolute clarity that his circumstances had no legitimate authority over the ruling faculty of his mind. The modern erosion of the inner citadel does not typically happen through dramatic assault. It happens quietly, over time, through 1,000 small surrenders. Each time you alter your true opinion to avoid someone's disapproval, a stone is removed from the wall. Each time you allow someone else's anxiety to override your reasoned judgment, another stone goes. Each time you abandon a value not because you have examined and changed it, but because holding it became inconvenient, the fortress weakens. The Stoic practice of guarding the citadel begins with identification. What is actually yours? Not what you own, not what you have built, not who you are to other people, but what is genuinely, inalienably interior. Your capacity for reason, your ability to choose your response, your values when held with honesty, your attention when directed with intention. That is the citadel, small, but absolute. The second part of the practice is vigilance against the specific forces that attempt to breach it. Opinion, the relentless pressure to align your interior with what others expect of it. Fear, which presents itself as realism, but functions as a thief, stealing present action in exchange for imagined future catastrophe. Distraction, which does not storm the gates but simply keeps them perpetually open, so that nothing of depth can settle long enough to become conviction. You cannot control the world. You cannot control what people do, what systems produce, what fate delivers. But the citadel, if you know where it is and choose to defend it, remains yours. Marcus Aurelius, writing in conditions of war, grief, and political betrayal, kept returning to this, not as consolation, but as orientation. He was reminding himself in the dark hours of what was actually at stake, not the empire, the interior. Rule 7. Act virtuously when it costs you something. It is easy to be principled when principles are cheap. It costs nothing to be honest when the truth is flattering. It costs nothing to be disciplined when discipline is comfortable. It costs nothing to be generous when generosity is publicly rewarded. The true test of a Stoic rule, and the true test of a person's character, is the moment when the virtuous action carries a real price. Seneca writes in On the Shortness of Life that most men are only virtuous when virtue is convenient. And he is not writing about other people. He is writing about the enemy inside every person who has ever chosen comfort over integrity and told themselves it was wisdom. The Stoics defined virtue, arete, not as a feeling or an aspiration, but as an action, specifically as the right action, chosen and executed in the moment when the wrong action was easier, more rewarding, or less costly. Virtue, in the Stoic framework, is not the absence of temptation. It is the conscious navigation of temptation in the direction of what is right. That navigation, when practiced repeatedly and at real cost, builds something that no external condition can replicate. The kind of self-respect that does not require anyone's validation because it was earned in private, against real resistance. What does it cost to be virtuous? It costs approval sometimes. The honest answer that the room did not want to hear. The refusal to participate in a consensus built on dishonesty. The decision to be transparent about a failure when concealment would have been simple and undetected. These costs are not abstract. They are felt in real relationships, real professional situations, real daily encounters. It costs comfort. Discipline, in any domain, from physical to intellectual to relational, requires the consistent sacrifice of the path of least resistance. The Stoic does not pursue discomfort for its own sake, but neither does he allow comfort to be the deciding factor when the question at hand is what kind of person he is becoming. It costs time. The examined life, which Socrates considered the only life worth living and the Stoics made the foundation of their practice, is slower than the unexamined one, pausing to ask whether this action aligns with your stated values, whether this response reflects the person you intend to be, whether this choice serves something beyond immediate gratification. These are not fast processes. And in a world built for speed, slowness is itself a form of resistance. Marcus Aurelius writes in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 3, paragraph 16, that very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. But that way of thinking does not arrive automatically. It is purchased through exactly this kind of costly, consistent, deliberate virtue. The unbreakable mind is not built in the easy moments. It is built in the moments when breaking was the simpler option. The enemy within. Recognizing your own emotional traps. You have enemies, but the most persistent, most damaging, and most difficult to defeat are not the ones who oppose you from the outside. They are the patterns you built inside yourself. Patterns so old, so familiar, so perfectly calibrated to your specific psychological history that you stopped recognizing them as patterns at all. They feel like personality. They feel like reality. They feel in many cases like the most honest version of who you are. They are traps. And the Stoics, who were among the most rigorous self-examiners in the ancient world, were unsparing in their inventory of them. The craving for validation is the first trap. It is the one most people will recognize and most quickly dismiss as a problem they do not have, which is itself evidence of how deeply it operates. The craving for validation does not always announce itself as insecurity. It disguises itself as the reasonable desire to be understood, as the legitimate wish to be appreciated, as the natural preference for agreement over conflict. And in those disguises it determines choices, shapes behavior, and quietly outsources the authority over your interior life to the shifting opinions of people whose attention you may not even value. Seneca observes in Letters to Lucilius, Letter 7, that the association with many people is harmful, not because other people are inherently dangerous, but because the craving for their approval is a force that, left unchecked, gradually replaces your own judgment with a collective one. And the collective is not interested in your virtue. It is interested in your compliance. The addiction to urgency is the second trap. The feeling that everything requires immediate response, that the inbox demands your attention now, that the conflict must be resolved tonight, that the problem cannot wait until your mind is clear enough to address it well. This addiction is not driven by the genuine urgency of circumstances. It is driven by the anxiety of stillness, because in stillness the things you have been avoiding through motion become audible, and the mind that has built urgency into its identity will manufacture reasons to stay in motion rather than face them. The fear of stillness is the third trap, and perhaps the deepest. Marcus Aurelius writes in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, Paragraph 3, to look within. Within is the fountain of good, and it is always ready to bubble up if you always look. But looking within requires a silence that most people actively resist, because silence is where accountability lives, where the gap between the person you present to the world and the person you actually are becomes impossible to ignore. Recognizing these traps is not the same as being free of them, but it is the precondition for freedom. A trap only works in the dark. When you see it clearly, not with self-judgment but with the precise and honest attention that the Stoics called prosoche, you have already removed its ambush power. You are still in the same room. But now, the lights are on. The Stoic and the Storm. How to stay calm when everything falls apart. Philosophy is easy in calm water. The real question has always been what happens when the storm arrives. Not the inconvenient disruption, not the manageable setback, the genuine collapse. The moment when multiple things go wrong simultaneously, when the structures you had built your stability on begin to fail, when the rational mind is outgunned by the speed and intensity of circumstances it cannot immediately resolve. This is the moment the Stoics designed their entire philosophy for, not the theoretical exercise, the actual storm. Epictetus teaches in the Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 5, that the Stoic approach to crisis is not the suppression of emotion, but the correct use of it. Emotion in the Stoic framework is not the enemy of reason. Unexamined emotion is. The feeling of fear in the presence of genuine danger is rational. The story that the danger is unsurvivable, that nothing can be done, that collapse is inevitable, that is where reason must intervene. The first step in the storm is to stop. Not passively, not helplessly, but deliberately. One breath. One moment of interior separation between the event and the response. Not to deny the event. To create the smallest possible gap between stimulus and action, because inside that gap is the only place where choice lives. The second step is triage. In the immediate chaos of a crisis, the mind tends toward the exhausting error of trying to address everything at once. The Stoic practice is the immediate application of the dichotomy of control. What in this situation is within my power right now? Not tomorrow. Not in the best-case scenario. Right now. That question reduces the overwhelming to the actionable. It does not make the crisis smaller, it makes the response proportional. The third step is what Marcus Aurelius calls returning to the ruling faculty. In the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 7, Paragraph 9, he writes that the universe is transformation. Life is opinion. In the middle of a storm, this is not a philosophical comfort. It is an operational instruction. The situation is what it is. The opinion you are applying to it, the catastrophizing, the self-blame, the projection of worst outcomes, is yours to change. Not the situation. The opinion. This does not make the storm stop. Marcus Aurelius's storms did not stop. Epictetus's storms did not stop. Seneca's storm, which included exile, loss of wealth, and eventually the order of his own execution by the emperor he had served, did not stop. But the men remained. Not intact in the sense of unaffected, intact in the sense of undivided. Their inner citadels held, because they had practiced, long before the storm arrived, the exact steps that a stormy situation requires. The capacity to stay calm when everything falls apart is not a temperamental gift. It is a trained response, And like all trained responses, it is available to anyone willing to do the training. The tyranny of other people's opinions. Here is a question worth sitting with honestly. How many of your decisions today were made, even partially, based on what someone else would think of them? Not a harmful other, not an authority with legitimate power over your life. Just the ambient awareness of judgment, the invisible audience that lives in the modern mind, formed from years of social feedback, comparison, and the quiet but relentless pressure to perform a version of yourself that meets with approval. This is not a character flaw. It is a deeply conditioned response to a social environment that has always, to some degree, made belonging conditional on conformity. The problem is not that the pressure exists. The problem is that most people have never examined the extent to which it governs them. They believe they are making free choices while their inner citadel is occupied by the standing army of other people's expectations. Marcus Aurelius, who as emperor of Rome lived under a level of public scrutiny that most people cannot imagine, writes in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, Paragraph 3, words that functioned as a daily vaccine against this tyranny. How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does or thinks. This is not misanthropy. Marcus Aurelius was a man of profound relational care. It is the Stoic recognition that the opinions of others are, by definition, outside the sphere of what belongs to you, and therefore outside the scope of what should govern your choices. Seneca is even more direct in Letters to Lucilius, Letter 1, when he writes that the time you waste living up to the image others have of you is time stolen from the only life you actually have. The word he uses is not metaphorical. He means it precisely, that living for the approval of others is a theft of the self, committed not by the people whose approval is sought, but by the person doing the seeking. What does it actually look like to be governed by other people's opinions? It looks like staying in situations that are wrong for you because leaving would require an explanation that might not be understood. It looks like not expressing views you hold with conviction, because those views are unfashionable in the rooms you frequent. It looks like shaping the presentation of your life, publicly, professionally, personally, around the impression it creates rather than the truth it reflects. It looks like the chronic low-grade anxiety of someone who has outsourced the definition of their own worth. The Stoic reclamation of this territory begins with a single honest question. Whose approval am I actually seeking, and why does their judgment hold authority over me? Not as an accusation, as an audit. Because when you examine the faces in the invisible audience, you often find that many of them are people whose judgment you do not actually respect, or people who are not paying nearly as much attention as you imagined, or ghosts from a past that no longer exists, but whose voices you have been faithfully carrying. You are not obligated to live inside someone else's assessment of you. That is not freedom from accountability. The Stoics believed deeply in accountability. It is freedom from the mistaken belief that the assessment of others is more accurate about you than your own reasoned judgment. Your life belongs to you. That is not an inspirational statement. It is a philosophical fact with daily implications. Discipline as the highest form of self-respect. The word discipline has accumulated a particular set of associations in the modern mind. Associations of restriction, of privation, of joylessness. Discipline is what you impose on yourself when you want something but must deny yourself the wanting. It carries the flavor of punishment, of saying no to the good things. The Stoics would not recognize this definition. For Marcus Aurelius, for Seneca, for Epictetus, discipline was not the subtraction of pleasure from life. It was the construction of a life worth living. It was the practical architecture of virtue, the daily, specific, concrete choices through which a person builds the self that their values require them to be. Seneca writes in On the Shortness of Life that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. The waste he is describing is not leisure or rest. It is the undisciplined drift of a life that never chose its direction, that moved wherever comfort, habit, or the path of least resistance pointed, and arrived at the end having covered great distance without traveling anywhere that mattered. Discipline, in the Stoic sense, begins with clarity about values. You cannot be disciplined in the direction of what you have never decided you actually want. This is why the Stoics placed such emphasis on the philosophical examination of desire, not to eliminate desire, but to ensure that the desires being pursued were genuinely yours, genuinely aligned with virtue, and genuinely worth the cost of their pursuit. Undisciplined desire, desire that operates without examination, produces a life of frenetic activity in all directions, each direction overriding the last, and the net movement is approximately zero. Once the direction is clear, discipline becomes not a burden but a form of integrity. Each act of following through on what you said you would do, to yourself, in private, with no external accountability, is a brick in the construction of the self. Each time you do what your values require when your emotions are pushing for the opposite, you are not punishing yourself. You are building yourself. You are making a deposit in the account that the Stoics called character. Marcus Aurelius opens the Meditations with a long inventory of what he learned from the people he admired most: his teachers, his family, his predecessors. What strikes a careful reader is how consistently the virtues he lists are active ones. Not passive contentment, but disciplined engagement. Not the absence of vice, but the daily practice of virtue at real cost. He learned from his grandfather, he writes, to be gentle and meek. From his father, to be modest and manly. From his mother, to be religious and bountiful. These are not descriptions of personality. They are descriptions of practiced disciplines. The highest form of self-respect is not believing in your own worth. It is acting in accordance with it. Belief without action is not respect. It is a pleasant story. Discipline is what makes the story real. It is what converts the value from a held idea into a lived reality. And a lived reality, even a difficult, costly, imperfect one, is worth more than 1,000 perfect beliefs that never left the page. The present moment as the only arena. Where are you right now? Not physically, mentally, because the answer to that question, for most people in most moments, is somewhere else entirely. Replaying a conversation that happened last week, pre-living an event that may or may not occur next month. Rehearsing an argument, mourning a loss, projecting a worry, all of it taking place in a time that is not now, in response to events that are either over or hypothetical. The Stoics identified this displacement from the present as one of the primary mechanisms of unnecessary suffering. Not because the past and future are irrelevant, they are not, but because they are the only two addresses where helplessness is guaranteed. You cannot act in the past. You cannot act in the future. You can only ever act now. And a mind that is perpetually somewhere other than now is a mind that has surrendered its only genuine arena for action. Seneca opens his letters to Lucilius, letter 1, with a deceptively simple instruction: seize the hours, reclaim the time. He is not writing about productivity. He is writing about presence, about the radical act of inhabiting the life you are actually living rather than the one you are remembering or anticipating. Marcus Aurelius returns to this theme in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 2, paragraph 14, with a meditation on the irrelevance of both fame and historical legacy to the quality of present action. He is reminding himself that the only moment in which virtue can be practiced is this one, not the memory of past virtue, not the intention of future virtue, the present choice, made in the present moment, under present conditions. This is not a rejection of planning or reflection. The Stoics were careful thinkers who valued both. It is the rejection of the specific habit of mind that uses the past and future as permanent residences, places where the mind retreats to avoid the demands of the present. Because the present makes demands. It asks you to act, to respond, to be accountable to what is actually happening. The past and future ask nothing. They are safe. And the safety they offer is exactly as illusory as it sounds. The practice of present moment attention is not complex. It is simply the repeated return, as many times as necessary, of the mind to what is actually in front of it. Not what was in front of it last Tuesday. Not what might be in front of it next year. What is here now? The conversation that is happening. The task that is in front of you. The person in the room. the choice being presented. Each return to the present is not a failure to have stayed there. It is the practice itself. The Stoic does not achieve permanent presence and then maintain it effortlessly. The Stoic returns again and again, as Marcus Aurelius returned again and again in the Meditations, to the only moment in which anything can be done. The practice is the returning, and the returning, done with discipline and without self-judgment, builds over time the kind of mind that does not need to escape its own present, because it has learned to live in it. When everything is taken, what remains? This is the question at the edge of Stoic philosophy. Not the comfortable edge where the principles feel like good advice for managing stress. The real edge. The place where the philosophy is asked to prove itself against the hardest possible conditions. What remains when everything is taken? Seneca faced this question. Twice exiled, stripped of wealth and position, ultimately condemned to death by the emperor he had advised and educated. In his final hours, according to Tacitus, he spoke to his friends with composure, not with false bravery or performed dignity, with the genuine equanimity of a man who had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. He was asked what remained. He answered, the example of his life. Epictetus faced this question in the most literal possible way. Born with nothing, given no rights, subject to the will of a man who was willing to break his body for the satisfaction of demonstrating ownership. What remained after the stripping was complete. The ruling faculty, the capacity to choose his response, the interior life that no external condition had the power to colonize. Marcus Aurelius, who had everything, empire, power, legacy, meditated constantly on its impermanence. Not because he wanted to be indifferent to it, but because he understood that attachment to what could be taken was itself a form of captivity. In the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 9, paragraph 3, he writes of the transience of all things, how quickly they pass, how completely they vanish, and then asks, what is left? What is always left? For those who looked for it in the right place, what is always left is the character, not the reputation, that lives in other people's minds and is therefore theirs, not yours. The character, the specific pattern of responses, values, and choices that you built through your practice. The discipline that held when comfort was available. The integrity that persisted when concealment was easy. The equanimity that you chose, in small and large moments, over the easy release of reactivity. This is not a consolation for loss. The Stoics did not pretend that loss was painless. Seneca wept for his friends. Marcus Aurelius grieved his children. Epictetus understood the cost of what was taken from him. The Stoic response to loss is not the elimination of grief. It is the refusal to let grief become the last word. The refusal to let what was taken define what remains. What remains, when everything is taken, is the only thing that was ever genuinely and inalienably yours. Not possessions, not status, not the approval of others, not even health. What remains is the response you chose, the virtue you practiced, the interior life you built with more care than you built anything external. And that, precisely that, is what no circumstance, no person, no force in the world can reach. The unbreakable mind is a daily decision. You have arrived at the end of this video. But if what you have encountered here has found its mark, you already sense that there is no end to what is being asked. Because what is being asked is not a single transformation. It is a practice, a daily practice. One that begins again every morning, regardless of how well or how poorly the day before it went. The unbreakable mind is not a destination. It is not a credential. It is not a state you achieve and then maintain without effort. Marcus Aurelius understood this better than anyone. He was one of the most powerful men in the world. He had studied Stoic philosophy for decades, and he still needed to write the Meditations, still needed to remind himself every day of the principles that the pressure of his life constantly threatened to erode. The Meditations were not composed for publication. They were personal notes, a man in conversation with himself, returning daily to the practice, not because he had mastered it, but because mastery required the return. Seneca writes in Letters to Lucilius, letter 77, that we should every day lay hands upon ourselves. He means this not metaphorically but practically, that the examined life requires daily examination, not annual review. The drift away from virtue is slow and quiet, and it is only the habit of daily return that makes it visible before it becomes irreversible. Epictetus, in the Enchiridion, instructs his students to begin each day with the question, "What stands in the way of my progress today?" Not as an act of anxiety, but as an act of preparation. The Stoic does not wait to be ambushed by the demands of the day. He meets the day with a prepared mind, having already identified the most likely obstacles, the most probable emotional traps, the specific places where his practice will be tested. This is the architecture of the unbreakable mind, not a single dramatic act of transformation but the accumulation of daily decisions, each one small in isolation, each one consequential in compound. The decision to pause before reacting, the decision to release what cannot be controlled, the decision to use the obstacle rather than be stopped by it, the decision to see clearly rather than label reflexively, the decision to guard the inner citadel against the erosions of fear, opinion, and distraction, the decision to act virtuously when the cost is real, the decision to return however many times it takes to the present moment as the only arena of genuine action. None of these decisions are made once. They are made every day, in traffic, in difficult conversations, in the face of failure, in the presence of loss, in the quiet moments where no one is watching, and the easiest choice is to abandon the practice without consequence. The Stoics were not saints. They were not beyond temptation, not immune to pain, not free from the human experience of difficulty and doubt. What they were was committed to the daily return, committed to the practice as a form of devotion, not to an external God, but to their own highest capacity as rational, virtuous, free human beings. Peace does not wait at the end of your circumstances improving. It does not arrive when the difficult person leaves, when the financial pressure lifts, when the health crisis resolves, when the external world finally arranges itself into something manageable. Peace is what happens when the mind has been built, through the specific and daily practice of these rules, into something that does not require circumstances to cooperate in order to function. That mind is not reserved for philosophers. It is not inherited. It is not dependent on intelligence, history, or privilege. It is available to anyone willing to do the work of building it. One day, one decision, one return to the practice at a time. The question is not whether you are capable of it. You are. The question is whether you will begin today. Begin today.